Welcome everybody. I'm very happy to be here with these fantastic deaf disabled artists today, discussing around the topic of deaf disabled artists largely have no access to cultural higher education, and I'm very curious to know about your experience. How have you developed your own training? How did you get where you are? So first, we introduce ourselves. I'm Aristide Rontini. I'm a performer, choreographer, dance community practitioner, and activist inside the collective Aldiqua Artists, which is association of artists with disability in Italy who advocates rights of people with disability and artists with disability in the art sector in Italy. I am quite tall. I'm in my late 40s. I have dark brown hair, dark brown eyes, very dark brown beard, and I have a shorter right arm. So I ask you please to introduce yourself.
Shall I go? My name is Kate. I am a self-identifying CRIP artist researcher. I have a background in choreography and collaborative practice with other deaf and disabled artists. I am a white woman in her late 40s. I have long brown hair with a fringe.
Hello everyone. So my name is Gisato. My sign name is Just Tapping on the Nose. So is my background. I'm a deaf artistic director, a performance artist, and also a BSL art guide. In terms of my appearance, I'm wearing all black today, and I've got dark hair, got a black top and bottoms. In terms of my appearance, I have East Asian features, and I was born in Japan, and I'm now based in London.
My name is Katarzyna Żeglicka. I come from Poland. I'm a genderqueer and CRIP artist and activist. On top of this, I'm also a theater pedagogue and a trainer in self-defense and assertiveness for women. I'm short, I'm white, I'm also in my 40s, and I go by they, them for pronouns in English.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So let's go to the first question. Really love you to tell us what is your official education and how did you get in touch with artistic practice to art sector in general?
I did get formal higher education, and technically I was educated as a cultural animator. Recently I also completed a course in theater pedagogy. Actually, my artistic education is fully informal. I was mostly struggling to find access to it myself and funded it myself. My artistic education my path as an artist is in a way an extension of me being an activist, and the point where it intersected was my participation in the 1 Billion Rising flash mob, which is an international action made on Valentine's Day to raise awareness about trigger warning date rape. Ever since first taking part in the radical dancing, I was looking for opportunities to develop myself and get further education. Well, it was a constant battle. I was able to finish a course in stage choreography, and I was the only person with a disability in the group.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So in terms of my educational background, previously I lived in Japan, and my degree was in art. So at that time, in terms of art, I felt a real connection to that there was something wasn't right at that time. You know, I'd be given, you know, a letter that was said, you know, one man said a British individual was coming over to Japan who was going to teach us about deaf and disability, and it was specifically relating to a dance workshop. And I thought, you know, so far I'm a deaf individual, but I've never, you know, engaged with dancing, and I know dance kind of as a concept meant to following music, which I wasn't able to do. And I thought, okay, I've had this invitation, why not come and get involved? So I got involved in the workshop. And, you know, it was almost like dance is, you know, it's a 3D art form, and I was so astonished by it. And I really, you know, fell into a rabbit hole with it and fell into the world of it. I was really lucky with the Japanese company that funded me to go over and travel the world and learn more about dance and get more of a dance education and research, you know, the education around the world for deaf and disabled individuals in terms of dance. And I found there really wasn't much out there for deaf and disabled individuals, but I saw it in Britain, Laban. So I went over to the Laban Centre and I had a 1.5 year learning experience. And at the same time, I also travelled. I did different dance workshops, tried to get involved in lots of different ones. And of course, I did some workshops in Japan, in Buta, so just signed for Buta there as well. It was a really good opportunity for me to learn about Japanese dance styles and how that could relate to the learning I'd done at Laban, which was very European contemporary, and how those could work together. And that's been much my part of my journey.
Thank you very much.
Some similarities to Kasia and Chisato. I was always interested in moving my body and dancing, but at the time that I was growing up, there were no role models. Deaf and disabled people were not on the stages or on the screen. I had no idea that it was a possibility. So I did do a training in dance and related arts at university, but I was very much encouraged that I would have a career in dance management, that at this point that there were no deaf and disabled artists performing, but it was felt that I could be an administrator or a manager, and I was kind of happy with that. And then in my last year at university, similarly to Chisato, I suspect it was the same person. I did a workshop with Adam Benjamin in my 3rd year, and it was the first time I had encountered dancers with bodies anywhere, in any way similar to mine, and it was such a good timing for me to understand that I could pursue a career as a dancer, and I didn't have to kind of be behind the scenes and hidden away. So then I worked for 1 intensive year with Kanduko Dance Company as a trainee. And then actually, through my own choice, when I finished that traineeship, I actually then did work in dance management and administration, which now I'm really glad I did. And then I joined Kanduko as a dancer and a teacher, where really that's where I would say my dance training really happened, just through touring and being around, being with peers and learning in that way, and working with different artists, different choreographers. And then I just worked as a dancer for many, many years and as a teacher. And when I was in my 30s, I began to become very interested in research. And I had lots of questions around the philosophy of disability and deaf and disabled experience. And I was more and more frustrated with a lack of representation. I had many questions. So almost as Kasia was saying, I pushed into doing a master's qualification. And then after my master's, I had the opportunity to study for a PhD. So I came to that part of my education quite late. But in a way, my formal education came in two halves. One was very much about practical training in dance, and the other one was about my frustration and my own questions around what I wanted to experience.
Thank you very much. Very different, but at the same many common things, and also how every one of you find their own way and following their desire to get knowledge, training opportunities, and keep on dancing in a way. I'm very glad to hear. And my next question would be, I mean, what strategies did you find to overcome the lack of access to higher education? And in a way you already answered, but I give you also into more detail this, ask you to go into more details.
I feel like I was mostly empowered by my previous activist practice, because this is where I where I had the experience of working in groups that put emphasis on awareness about violence, discrimination, and like group process and so on and so forth. And I think this is where I came into contact with good practices that have actually informed the way I learn and also the way I teach.
Tak naprawdę to, jak nauczyłam się
In fact, me learning about consent, about creating safer spaces, is a direct outcome of me of being in and working with the queer feminist communities. And it was among these people that I also encountered individuals who were interested in dance, in studying movement. I also feel like the education in the Vendo Training Academy, the Self-Defense and Assertiveness for Women with Disabilities, even though self-defense might not relate that much to dance directly, but the high emphasis on body work is what informed my way of thinking very strongly, and also the piece of the part where assertiveness comes into question has influenced the way I'm actually trying to reach for the resources that I require. And I would also like to add that my strategies developed on the basis of assertiveness sometimes make me act rude, which has closed me a couple of doors.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I think it's a really interesting topic. I think I didn't realise at that time that I did have those barriers in place. So for example, when I was in Japan, I was studying in education with no interpreter, with no sign language interpreter. And that was seen as normal in that scape. So I felt I didn't have nothing. Now looking back, I can recognise that that was a barrier to me. I did not have an interpreter growing up, did not have access to them growing up in Japan. But I have learnt a lot through my education and being in that environment. Then looking at my experience in Britain and studying at Laban. I didn't understand English at that time. So the educators at Laban said, oh, Chisato, well, we can bring in an interpreter for you. I said, okay, an interpreter. Does that mean a British Sign Language interpreter? Or not, rather than a Japanese interpreter? Oh, okay, it's going to be a British Sign Language interpreter. Let's have a go. I must say I was quite lucky because, Laban is an international school. This means I wasn't the only only dancer that had English as a second or third language. There were lots of other individuals in similar circumstances studying there, so we were together in that. So this means during lectures, or most of us would be looking at interpreters rather than the lecturer. All eyes would be on the interpreter and everyone would be watching, because it would help all of us as international people understand. It was quite a funny situation. We've happened before where it was, chucking it down, it was raining, the interpreter was late because of the weather. And the lecturer could actually understand, please, we do actually need the interpreter in place for all of us. Can we wait for the interpreter? So the lecturer would hold off. Sometimes the lecturer would say, I'm teaching. The interpreter is not the teacher in this place. Please do remember that. I think that's quite nice, that interpreter was there for my access, but actually it became access for all of us watching the interpreter. And I think looking back at that, I think it was nice that my access became, quality for many individuals there. I mean, setting that example aside, I'm a deaf individual, and there were a lot of instances with issues coming across in the dance sphere. So, for example, the music would start. So it was how I could kind of know to follow that. So, Laban, or being in that dance world for the first time, thinking, how can we get a deaf individual in? How can we include them? That was, some barriers in place at the first. It does depend on the individuals, whether they're open-minded, they're ready to roll up their sleeves, they're ready to take on the challenge and say, come on, Giusato, let's work together. It really depends on some people that might, bear with it and say, okay, we've got a deaf person, and they'll kind of force me to say, okay, you're on now, that sort of attitude. And that has happened to me. I think as I've gone on, as I've learned over time, I think it's quite similar to Kasha's experience. I have had to become more assertive in this. And I've had to say, I'm a deaf individual. I need, a clear, mental picture of what is going on. And, telling people that. I think it's in terms of, I sometimes need time to, research concepts and understand them, and so I can understand the different concepts for myself.
It's really interesting for me hearing, listening to both of you, all of you, and trying to think how the strategies, trying to reflect on the strategies that I've used. Because what I think is important to identify that barriers to education in dance are, yes, there are practical barriers where we require access, interpreters, access into spaces, but we often, although there's some improvement, we also must recognise that many barriers are attitudinal and based on the model in education is based on a normative body. We're taught technique and choreography based on a normative body. And as someone who exists in a non-normative body, there's this tension all the time that my body doesn't fit. And that's my own attitudinal barrier of me feeling my body doesn't fit. And then the attitudinal barrier of peers and teachers of your body doesn't fit. There's a problem with your body. This was the biggest barrier, I think, for me. And I'm really interested in what both of you have said, that going back to my point about my education being early on in my life and then much later, when I was younger, like 18 to 25 and training in that way, I really wanted to fit in. I didn't want to be I was always the only one. I keep hearing this today, the only one. And I was always the only one in the class, and I really didn't want that. I wanted to fit in. So the first half of my training, I was trying to assimilate, trying to be as close to normal as I could. And the second part of my training, so the strategy for that was actually keep my head down, fit in, do the work, do what's being asked. And in the second half of my education, which is where I started to engage with my own questions, my strategy was, and still is, to position myself around all of you, to position myself really clearly in these deaf, disabled and CRIP spaces. And that's such a clear, that's a strategy. And I feel kind of glad that I've done both, but they're very different ways. So my strategy now, it's funny because I'm maybe the opposite, that I was not at all angry or aggressive in my younger training, but as I've become older, I'm much pushier. I'm much more assertive in what I want to learn and do.
I feel very similar to you, I guess, but there's also one thing that nags me about this assertiveness, because more often than not, when I'm trying to learn something, I actually have to be very focused, very aware, and very suspicious. It's kind of like I feel distracted from actually learning something because I'm trying to detect things that detect those invisible barriers, and it's a job I shouldn't be doing while learning, because I was never taught anything by a teacher or a trainer that would be deaf or with a disability.
I wonder if I can just comment on something you said there around educating educators. And for me, there's something really important, because in my career, so much of my work has been educating teachers and in different contexts. And I think now I'm at a point in my career where I don't want to do that anymore. I think after 20 years, I don't want to talk about making a ballet class accessible or inclusive. I don't want that to be my job anymore. And I want to be careful, because I absolutely want access in education, and I absolutely want any deaf, disabled artist to do a ballet class if they want to. But I have questions around how our knowledge and our bodies are instrumentalized to teach people who still hold on to these very normative systems of teaching. And I guess I also question what difference one day of workshop or a week of workshops to teaching teachers how to teach inclusively. I'm not sure. I think we need the change needs to be more systemic, more radical.
Yeah, if I can add to that. I think that's a really true point for deaf and disabled individuals. So, for example, myself as a teacher, it reminded me of back in 2012, we had the London Paralympics and we had the opening ceremony for it. And I myself was involved in the opening ceremony with a lot of other deaf and disabled artists. And there were two directors. The first was a deaf woman, Jenny, that's her sign name. And her aim was, so far the Paralympic opening ceremonies hadn't actually involved disabled people, and she questioned why this was. And she thought, for this Paralympic opening ceremony, we have to make sure we've got deaf and disabled people involved. It was a long process, and I remember at first Jenny really wanted to include some aerial work. But people were kind of saying, deaf, disabled people getting involved with aerial work, it's quite dangerous. This was what people had thought in the past. And around 2010, I believe it was, or 2009, some deaf and disabled people were involved, and they set up a course. So there were some aerial teachers who had never taught deaf and disabled individuals, and they were trying to work out how, you know, we could make it accessible. And we got the aerialist teacher and some deaf and disabled people together, and every week we would look at different work and see how we could make it fit. We ended up creating a short performance from this, and it was looking at that process. That was successful, and you know, we all really were looking into the experience, and looking, you know, deaf and disabled people, we can do this, and we're confident in it. And the teacher was feeling more confident in their teaching for this group. So the group expanded, and we ended up having 50 deaf and disabled performers involved. So we had 50 deaf and disabled people involved in this for the final performance. And this training started in April to August. It was a 4-month progress, and every day 50 deaf and disabled people would be together training. We had around 10 aerialist teachers. Of course, you know, we had lots of deaf, disabled people, but everyone had different access needs within that. So we almost had to, you know, teach ourselves, teach each other, and it was a collaborative effort, working with each other. And at the same time, we had to make sure we were being safe, because we'd be up in a harness in the sky. And it was quite a dangerous activity. But in this process, there was a lot of respect for the individuals. There was a lot of open discussion and exchanges within that. And, you know, we had the teachers saying, you know, an individual might not have lower limbs, but they could create beautiful things. And this is something that, you know, perhaps the able-bodied aerialist teachers couldn't create themselves. And, you know, deaf individuals would be seeing what deaf individuals could do as well. It was truly astonishing. And it really was a good education, I would say. So, you know, the Paralympic opening ceremony finished, but it continued from that. And some aerialists want to continue involving deaf and disabled people in their performances, so that's continued from that. And I think it wasn't the teachers being taught, I think it was, you know, looking at how deaf and disabled people could become aerial artists within that. I hope that's clear.
I really just would like to point out some things that came out from this discussion. And then you can also add things that maybe I forgot. And one thing that it's very important to me, that it's the change of position also in leadership. So deaf and disabled artists should be hired as should be hired as leader, educator. This is making a very good difference as far as I hear. And also the method is more horizontal way, more than vertical. And also another thing very important to me, it's about also the normative model of body, which is an ableism, I think also, that comes up together. And it's also about how higher education in arts are structured and what kind of disciplines I have to teach. And this needs really to change the structure also, because what I feel sometimes is keeping on adapting in a way and trying to fit, and okay, there is access, but it's still try to fit there more than there are many the other way around. So this is not the model I want to have access. I want to have access that about dance. We are talking about dance here, and what can be dance, not what is dance or what was dance. What can be, thanks to my body, my experience, my living experience. So it makes very radical, subversive way of thinking, reframing education. So I really thank you very much for all the things you have been raising up these last 2 hours, almost. It was exciting.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you,
And let's go for a
Aristide. Thank
change.
you,
Go for a
tłumacze.
change. Go for a change.
Pora, żeby się zmienić.